There is a hobby of mine which puzzles me to this day, Howard wrote to Lovecraft in 1932. That is my interest in the people which, for the sake of brevity, I have always designated as Picts. I am of course aware that my use of the term might be questioned, but to me Pict must always refer to the small, dark Mediterranean aborigines of Britain. This is not strange, since when I first read of these aborigines, they were referred to as Picts. But what is strange is my unflagging interest in them. That is, as it says, from a letter from Robert E. Howard to H.P. Lovecraft, where he mentions his fascination with Picts. And that's what we're going to be talking about here on the Robert E. Howard Show. It is the Robert E. Howard Show once again. Welcome, my friends, welcome to stately Vaughan Manor and the Robert E. Howard Show. And we're going to be talking about Bran Mak Morn today, the king of the Picts. And in that little bit from that letter that I wrote you, you can see that Robert E. Howard was very interested in the people that he called the Picts. And we know that because the Picts show up all over the place in Robert E. Howard's fiction. The Picts show up in King Kull, the King Kull stories. They play a very important part in that. Brule, the Spear Slayer, is a Pict. They show up here and there in the Conan stories. And then finally, they show up in the Bran Mak Morn story. So these all take place literal ages apart. So the Picts are a very long-lived people. They have survived a very, very long time, and through all kinds of different cataclysms. These savage Picts. So it should be mentioned right off the top that the Picts that Robert E. Howard is talking about are very different from the Picts that actually existed. The Picts were real people who existed in Scotland in late antiquity and through the Middle Ages. And when we think about Picts historically, that's what we're talking about. He's talking about a different people, sort of, kind of based on those Picts, but also based on some other Aboriginal people. It's kind of like what Robert E. Howard did with the Sumerians. The Sumerians were real people too, but they were nothing like the Sumerians that showed up in the Conan stories. You can read about the Sumerians in Herodotus. So the Picts, these kind of savage tribal Aborigine people of Britain that have survived through ages, live as kind of these savage warring tribes. Bran Mak Morn first shows up in the first Bran Mak Morn story as a chief of a tribe of Picts. Eventually he unites different tribes of Picts and becomes a king. The king of the Picts. And Bran Mak Morn is trying to fight off the Romans. The Romans are his great enemy. He's trying to keep them from conquering all of Britain and overwhelming his people. At the beginning of this story, or this book, after the Picts have already survived through the pre-cataclysmic era and through the Hyborian Age, they are weakened. They are kind of a weakened people. They are a dying race. And Bran Mak Morn, in uniting them, this is kind of their last gasp, you know. Very interesting, very dark stories. Some of the best stuff he wrote, actually. But there wasn't much of it. As I am reminded, when I picked up this book, there were only 3 stories that actually feature Bran Mak Morn as a character. But outside the Conan stories and the Kull stories, Robert E. Howard did write quite a bit more about the Picts, so all of that is in here. There are a few other stories. There's a story where Bran Mak Morn is just remembered. He's remembered as a great king, and he's mentioned in this story, which is a really good story. So yeah, going through this volume, a big chunk of the back of this volume, they're all drafts and uncompleted works. A lot of stuff that Robert E. Howard left lying around. The first story in this book is Men of the Shadows, which was Robert E. Howard's introduction to this character. Pretty good story. Kings of the Night is the story that follows. Kings of the Night, which I've mentioned before in the Cull stories, is where Bran Mak Morn has organized not just his picks, but other people to fight off the Romans. And in this story, King Cull actually makes an appearance. He travels from the distant past into his King Cull's future to fight alongside Bran Mak Morn in this battle against the Romans. And it's a great story. It's really good. It is more of a Bran Mak Morn story than a King Cull story. King Cull kind of plays a secondary role, which is why I'm talking about it now instead of when I was doing Cull. But it's a great story. It's excellent. And that is followed by one of the greatest Robert E. Howard stories ever, Worms of the Earth, which I really look forward to talking about because that is a magnificent story, a tremendous horror story. It's a fantasy, historical fantasy, but it is more than anything else a horror story. And it certainly is one of the best stories that Robert E. Howard ever wrote. And some people consider it the best thing that he ever wrote. And it's kind of, I can see that. Worms of the Earth, excellent stuff. But that is the last story that Bran Mak Morn shows up in as a character. That is followed in this book, and that's about halfway through here. That's followed in this book by another story of Picks called The Dark Man, which features another character entirely. And at this point, Bran Mak Morn is long dead, and he's mentioned just as a great king. And so it's kind of a Cull story in that his influence is pretty strong in this story. I don't want to tell you why right now because I don't want to spoil the story. I probably will when I talk about it, but at this moment I'm not going to. But it's a really, really, really good story, The Dark Man. And yeah, that story was dynamite. After that, we get into some other Pick stories that Robert E. Howard wrote. A couple random Pick stories. One called The Little People, and which was written in 1928, which was highly influenced by the work of Arthur Machen, the great Welsh writer Arthur Machen. Arthur Machen had a great influence on Robert E. Howard, and you can really see those in a lot of these Bran Mak Morn stories. And the typescript to The Little People is actually reproduced here, which is really cool. There's some cool stuff in this book, and that's one of those things. We have The Children of the Night, which is another horror story which features Picks. We have a little bit of a Bran Mak Morn play, just a little teensy bit. Reproduction of a manuscript here, very old manuscript, and we've got a draft version of Worms of the Earth, which is really interesting. So there's some cool stuff in here that I look forward to talking about. The Bran Mak Morn stories, even though there are so few of them, were really, really good stories. A couple of them are great stories, and the character is really interesting. This character who is doing his best, not just to unite the Picts, but to keep them alive. To keep them alive as a nation. And it's a desperate fight. And the pressure of that really tells on him. The character work in these stories is really good. Bran Mak Morn comes off as a real person with real concerns. And to do what he wants to do, he has to make some hard decisions and go places he really regretted later. And yeah, there's some deep stuff going on in the Bran Mak Morn stories, particularly in Worms of the Earth, which I can't wait to talk about because that story is really good. So yeah, Bran Mak Morn. This is what we are going to be talking about for the next few weeks on the Robert E. Howard Show. One of his greatest characters, Bran Mak Morn. After Bran Mak Morn is done in about a month or so, we will be moving on to another character you might have heard of called Conan. So that'll be fun too. But Bran Mak Morn, The Last King. This, of course, is the Del Rey volume of Bran Mak Morn, which is the most complete volume, I believe, that you can get of Bran Mak Morn stories. It's excellent. You should pick this up. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.